Hi, my name is Marie Neubrander, and this semester I've been working with Dr. CJ in the Department of Mathematics in using tensors and stochastic automated networks in order to model and analyze biochemical reaction systems. So across a ton of different domains, we are beginning to see an ever-growing need to be able to effectively handle large quantities of data. And when we're trying to do this, we see that several challenges may arise, specifically with regards to being able to store all of our data efficiently, as well as do efficient calculations based on our data. In this project, our goal is specifically focused on modeling biochemical reaction systems, which, as you can believe, do see very, very, very large quantities of data as we're dealing with things on a molecular level, and those appear in large quantities. So within this realm of modeling biochemical reaction systems, my role this semester has been specifically focused on analyzing and using two prominent methodologies in the modeling and comparing and contrasting different ways that they produce different results, as well as proving various properties about these results. So in doing so, the primary mathematical tool that we are going to be talking about today are tensors. And so the way you can think of a tensor is a means of representing data in dimensions. And there, of course, you can start with your most basic case of having n equals 1, so a one-dimensional tensor, which is more commonly known as a vector. From there, we could also have a 2D tensor, which is more commonly known as a matrix. From there, we can also go into higher order dimensions, such as a 3D tensor, which you can think of as several matrices stacked on top of each other. We can get into higher order dimensions than this, getting into 4D, 5D tensors, et cetera. These, of course, become a lot harder to visualize, but they work essentially the same way, where each entry of the tensor is just a data point, and typically its row or column will have some sort of relevance to its meaning, and that will be very contextually dependent on what you're working on. So those are what we are using in our modeling. And as far as the specific system that we modeled this semester, I've been focused on the Michaelis-Menten reaction system. This is a system that involves four primary types of molecules: your substrate, your enzyme, your intermediate enzyme-substrate complex, and your product. So the way this system works is you start with your substrate and your enzyme, and they can combine to form an enzyme-substrate complex. From there, they can either separate back out into the enzyme and the substrate, or they can react, form products, which are shown in the orange and the blue, and then they'll have your product separated back away from your enzyme, and you'll be left again with an enzyme. So that's the system we've been modeling, but how are we actually modeling this system using our tensors? Well, the technique we're using is what's known as the chemical master equation, or the CME. And this allows us to model reaction processes such that we can predict the future state of a system based on our current state or the initial state we started in. And when I refer to a state, what I'm talking about is the quantity of each molecule we have at a particular point in time. So, for example, with the Michaelis-Menten reaction system, a state might look like this. Here, it's a one-dimensional tensor, so a vector, and it stores the quantities of the molecules in the order substrate, enzyme, enzyme-substrate complex, and product. Just as of a note, this isn't like the order it necessarily has to be in. There's no specific meaning to the order. You can choose what you want it to be when you're modeling your systems. You just have to be consistent throughout your entire modeling process. So, for example, here, this vector of 2, 1, 0, 2 would indicate that there are currently in this state 2 substrates, 1 enzyme, 0 enzyme-substrate complexes, and 2 products present. From here, the next main portion of the chemical master equation that we take into account are, of course, the reactions involved in the system. So these are how we change from one state to another, and they are pretty much the primary defining feature of our reaction system. Additionally, each reaction will have an associated rate, which becomes important when we're modeling the system, as we want to be able to tell how quickly reactions are occurring and which reactions might be more likely to occur given a particular state than another. So this is what our reaction system would look like for our Michaelis-Menten system. You have these 3 different reactions, which, as I described, show how your substrate and enzyme can combine to form your complex, separate back out, or form your product and your enzyme. When we're modeling, the main thing we're focusing on trying to find are our probability vectors, which indicate the probability of being at a particular state at a particular point in time. And these are stored in the vectors we'll call P of t, where t represents our time interval. So as a simple example, if we were looking at a vector that just stored probabilities for 2 states, if the entries were 0.7 and 0.3, that might indicate that there is a 70% chance that we're in state 1 and a 30% chance that we're in state 2 after that particular amount of time. So this is really what the core of our problem is trying to figure out how to model and find these probability vectors. Now we want to look at what we'll call our transition matrix. And this is what is primarily used in the calculations of the chemical master equation. Earlier we talked about our reactions, and these are sort of given by our system and used to define the system. However, the transition matrix is something we have to compute ourselves based off of these reactions in order to use it in our modeling. And this is sort of where the core problem of the chemical master equation comes into play. So what these matrices are used for is to indicate the propensity of transitioning from one particular state to another. So for instance, you would look at the entry in the ith row and the jth column to figure out the propensity of transitioning from state J to state I. So for example, here, the element in the first row and the second column, A12, would give you the propensity of transitioning from state 2 to state 1. The way this is used is in this equation we see P at time t, so the probability vector at time t, is equal to e raised to the power of a times t times the probability vector at time 0, which is just your initial probability vector. So using that initial state to figure out what your chances of being in the different states are after a certain amount of time. Now, as I mentioned, creating this transition matrix really is at the core problem of our chemical master equation and is what the focus of my research was this semester. So when you're creating a transition matrix, they are bound to get very large because they are theoretically supposed to represent the propensity of transitioning from any one state to any other state you could possibly have in your reaction system. However, if you don't have a bound on the number of molecules you're modeling, there's an infinite number of possibilities that you could have. So in order to handle this, we have to place a bound on the number of molecules that we are going to be modeling in our system. So for instance, we might say we want to look at the propensities for any states that have between 0 and 2 molecules in them, and we won't take into account any states that have more than 2 molecules. And you can set this on a case-by-case basis. You can determine maybe in some cases you want to look at a bigger transition matrix, some cases maybe a smaller one, but we always do need to bound the number so we don't deal with this infinite case here. And there are two primary methods in the literature of generating this transition matrix. So the first, the more recent one is what's typically referred to as the classic method. And this gained a lot of popularity when it was published in 2014, largely because it provided a lot of really interesting ways to decompose these matrices and store them more efficiently. People really latched onto this idea. It became very popular. And people sort of strayed away from the method that was produced in 2007, which was referred to in the literature as the SANS method. This method was pretty interesting. It was investigated towards its beginning, but again was overridden by the classic method. And a big part of my research was sort of rewriting this method and making it more efficient, making it more computationally effective, and then analyzing similarities and differences between the classic method and the SANS method. So when we actually go to create a transition matrix using these methods, we see some differences. This is the transition matrix that you can create for the Michaelis-Menten reaction, where you set the substrates and the products to go to a maximum of 2 molecules, and the enzyme-substrate complex and the enzyme to have a maximum of 1 each. So you're only looking at states where the substrate and the product go from 0 to 2, and the enzyme and the substrate complex range from 0 to 1. And this results in a 36 by 36 matrix. So as you can see, even for that very small number of molecules, you're already getting a kind of large matrix. And here we see the matrix representations. We're not looking at the actual elements in the matrices. Rather, we're looking at the number of non-zero values. That's what the blue dots represent. And you can already see that the classic method yields a matrix that has 42 non-zero elements, and the SANS method yields a matrix that has 32 non-zero elements. So very clearly, on a surface level, they do yield different results. And so when we look further into this, it really stems from the fact that when we limit this infinite number of possibilities, we run into some problems with the way it's generated, and these methods handle this problem differently. But on further investigation, the methods do lead to transition matrices where all non-diagonal elements are equivalent. So this is really cool, and working on a proof of this equivalency between the two methods was a primary portion of what I worked on this semester. In the future, we hope to be able to model more complex reaction systems using this method, for example, those dealing with genetics and DNA. And after this, we want to be able to incorporate tensor decompositions to make computation and storage more efficient. With that, I would like to say a thanks to Dr. CJ and the Render Research Scholars Program and open it up for any questions.
from what I understand, those diagonal elements are the probability of the system just staying in whatever its current state is. Why, I guess, why do these methods arrive at sort of different values for these diagonal elements?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is this comes down to what I mentioned about limiting the number of molecules that you see in the system. So when you have this, like, theoretically, you don't know exactly what starting state you're going to be in generally when you're making this transition matrix. So if you say, okay, I'm only going to model states where all the elements range from 0 to 2 values, right? Let's say you said your starting probability vector put you at the state where you had 2 of each element, right? There's a good chance there a reaction occurs that puts you at having 3 of one of the elements. But this state isn't included in that transition matrix you made, right? Because it's outside of the bounds of what you set your bounds to be. And so this is what we'd call a sink state, right? Where some of the probability is like lost out to that state that's not included in your matrix. So the classic method ends up forcing the diagonals to take it. The classic method does not necessarily do anything special to account for this. It just lets like the probability leak out, and then your probability vectors don't always sum to 1. But the SANS method tries to make the probabilities always come out to, like the total probability always come out to 1 anyways. So then it forces the diagonals to take this into account and sort of like take in that extra probability that was missing, if that makes sense.